Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself, what the organization is, what it does, what we stand for. And then I think after I do a brief introduction, what I can do is, since this is a small informal group, can really tailor my presentation to your particular interests. I do have a bevy of videos and media material which we keep on our website. In terms of understanding disability issues, particularly the issues that we've seen, a picture's worth 1,000 words really does help to view what the lives are like of the people who we are advocating for, to understand, grasp what it is that we're doing. So I do like to show video, but let's start out with a brief overview. I was actually invited here to Syracuse by Professor Arlene Cantor. I started off my career as her paralegal at a civil rights law firm in the late 1980s. It was then called the Mental Health Law Project. Now it's called the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. It was a civil rights group that was established very much as part of the American civil rights tradition. Within domestic U.S. disability rights, people with disabilities were very much inspired by the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement of African Americans, and the disability rights movement really followed. The same pattern has happened on the international level, where one movement takes inspiration from another. The rights of people with mental disabilities, though, goes back in a kind of pre-civil rights movement era. We in the United States in the 1950s had a system of services that locked people with disabilities away. In the 1950s, we literally had 500,000 people with intellectual and psychiatric disabilities locked away in institutions. It was kind of understood. I mean, it's built into our vocabulary, being sent to the loony bin. In Washington, D.C., it was St. Elizabeth's, being sent to St. Elizabeth's. Almost every city has built into its vocabulary what would happen to you if you were mentally ill or had a serious intellectual disability or what was then known as mental retardation. You could just be put away. But both changes and improved mental health care and social science demonstrated that people with disabilities actually live better lives, not locked up, but in the community. So there was both an improvement in social services that showed that people didn't have to be locked up and that the institutions caused the problem, and a parallel civil rights movement. I studied psychology in college. I planned to go into mental health services myself. But when I went and volunteered in a psychiatric hospital, I found it so depressing that I personally decided I want to get as far away from this as possible. I put my mental health work behind me. And I actually, when I graduated from college in 1985, I decided I was an idealistic young guy. I wanted to go, I actually went to Israel to join the peace movement. And I did work in the Palestinian occupied territories, got involved in human rights advocacy, and returned to the United States, planning to go to law school to study international human rights, and never dreamed that my mental health work would be linked with my international human rights work. But while I was applying to law schools and waiting, I happened to stumble across a job at a civil rights group that worked on the rights of people with mental disabilities. For me, it was an amazing connection to see a rights issue and a mental health issue working together. The organization was committed to using civil rights law and litigation, to ending institutionalization, to pushing for deinstitutionalization. And my job, actually, I was not in law school, 24-year-old kid with a little background. Because the lawyers were so busy in the litigation, I was the guy that the public would get when someone locked up in the hospital had a civil rights problem. They got me. And so My job was to not disturb the lawyers too much because they were doing much more important things. But it was actually an incredible education on my part to be taking these calls and hearing what the day-to-day civil rights issues were for people who had heard of the organization, who were either locked up in institutions or living in the communities and getting inadequate services. So that, to me, I really look back on as the moment that I became aware of what it was like to live with a mental disability in the United States. But my goal was to do international human rights. When I went to law school, I studied international human rights and was shocked and amazed to find that there were no NGOs. This is now the late 1980s.
Wow.
No NGOs. In fact, nothing in the field of human rights for people with disabilities. The women's rights community was just starting to develop. The human rights community more broadly had developed, but this was an area of a total gap. I remember I was doing a seminar paper in international human rights, and I literally went to the library to research this issue, and when you did a search on international human rights and mental health, what you got were reports of the Soviet mental health system in which political dissidents were put into psychiatric institutions.
So, do you mind is it okay if we
Sure.
drop with a question?
Yep.
So were you saying that in the late 80s there was no disability rights NGO that focused on mental health or any?
There were, in the United States, there was an active movement. In many other countries, there were active movements. But there was no examination of there was no international movement. There was no recognition that international law protected people with disabilities. Many disability groups in Europe were actually very much inspired by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and disability groups were very isolated, working in their own countries. Much of the world had no disability movement, but in the countries that they were all separate, isolated movements. And the United States was very much on the cutting edge and very much seen as a model, but international law was not used. And indeed, the international organizations, I found, were completely ignorant of these issues. The reports that I looked at about the political abuse of psychiatry were an incredibly eye-opening experience for me, because what would happen was it was understood that the Soviet Union was using its mental health system to discredit and put away dissidents. And so Amnesty International and other human rights organizations sent investigative teams into the psychiatric facilities of the Soviet Union to examine what was going on. And the reports that they wrote describing a 1,000-bed psychiatric facility sounded exactly like the psychiatric facilities that we had been fighting against in the United States. We had 1,000-bed psychiatric facilities, and our civil rights movement recognized that people shouldn't be locked up and was working to liberate them and get them into society. But when Amnesty International, or the U.S. State Department, or the International Human Rights, they went in, what they saw is a 1,000-bed facility, and there was one political dissident in that facility, and they would say, it's a human rights violation for this person to be locked up because they're a dissident, and it was as if the other 1,000 people were background. If they had rights, well, maybe the psychiatrists weren't as progressive as they were in the United States. That was a social problem, not a human rights problem. There was a report that was done actually in Romania, and this, where electroconvulsive therapy. Do you know what ECT is? Electroconvulsive. It's a treatment for depression. It's a highly controversial treatment. If any of you have seen the old movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in the United States, it was kind of one of those so controversial treatment that it helped spur an advocacy movement to fight it, where people were given shock treatment to the brain. It was used as a treatment for severe depression, and actually it still is used as a treatment for severe depression. It's not as common as it once is. It's actually on the upswing. And one of the reasons it's controversial is that it can cause amnesia. You can lose your short-term memory. And it can be abused to essentially sedate people, hold them down. But in the United States, where it was used and used controversially, when a person is subjected to ECT, they're given anesthesia. They're given muscle relaxants. So they have no memory or feeling of the electricity coursing through their bodies. But in Romania, there was a practice that was documented that was called unmodified ECT. And that meant ECT, electroshock, with no anesthesia and no muscle relaxants, so you could feel the electricity going through your body. And so the question is, a person tied down and given electric shocks, in any other context, this would be torture. And yet Amnesty International, in their report that they did in 1984, said, we interviewed the doctors. And unlike in the Soviet Union, where it was an intentional political effort to abuse psychiatry to squelch political dissidents, in Romania, these were well-meaning doctors who were doing their best to help the patients, and they believed this was the best thing that they could do to treat depression, and it was not their intent to harm the patients. And so, if it causes pain, that is a medical ethical issue and not a human rights issue. So we have a report by Amnesty International specifically saying, if you have a disability, you can be tied down and shocked, but it's not an abuse because of the intent. So I wrote a law review article in law school examining what the international law was. And there was no explicit international law on this, but there was a prohibition on torture. And if you look closely, this is not a law school class, so we won't go into the subtleties, because torture does have a purpose and an intent requirement, and yet the infliction of pain by a government authority is ultimately torture. And so I wrote a paper in law school saying that detaining people in a psychiatric hospital with no due process was a form of arbitrary detention, and that the international law applied. Now we get to the part that concerns you. I graduate from law school, I want to go into international human rights, and I feel that there's an enormous gap in the field. I was personally fortunate enough, perhaps, that breaking into the human rights field was a difficult enough experience. I couldn't get a job. And so I applied for various fellowships, and I thought that what we needed to do is create a human rights organization, a new human rights organization, because Amnesty wasn't doing it, Human Rights Watch wasn't doing it, the existing organizations, the disability groups weren't looking at international law, and so I decided to set up my own organization that would look at how international human rights law applies to people with disabilities. I got a $20,000 fellowship from something called Echoing Green to help me set up. I found a law school, American University, that the Washington College of Law at American happens to have a very deep commitment to human rights. They gave me free office space and a telephone line. And so with $20,000 and a free office, I set up an organization. And at the time I set it up, I assumed that if I went out and did a report like Amnesty International, all I would need to do is write 1 or 2 reports, and then the human rights community would catch on, and I could go home and go on to my real career. I went and I did reports. We exposed these issues. The mainstream human rights community was actually surprisingly resistant to getting into this field. We brought a lot of attention to these issues. Our real breakthrough happened in a report that I did on Mexico. And that report came out in the year 2000. Mexico has a vast, vast psychiatric system. And I can show you some of the video of what we saw in there, where children and adults with intellectual disabilities and psychiatric disabilities, their lives are thrown away. They're put in facilities, surrounded by barbed wire fences, held naked, tied down. In one facility that we visited, there was no running water or heat. And shortly after our visit, some people literally froze to death because of the lack of heat. It was truly shocking. We brought a reporter from the New York Times Magazine in, and a brilliant photographer named Gene Richards. We got a 16-page spread in the New York Times Magazine. We brought ABC News in. The ABC News cameras went in after we had already broken the story, interviewed the Minister of Health. who said, I'm horrified and ashamed. I had no idea this was going on in the mental health systems of my own country. We promised that we're going to fix this problem within 6 months. He had no clue how deep the problem was. Deinstitutionalization in the United States took 20, 30 years. He wasn't fixing the problem in 6 months. But they had to show some kind of progress. So what did the government of Mexico do? We were able to close one very abusive facility and create some community services, which I consider a great step forward. The government of Mexico wanted to demonstrate that it cared about this subject, and so it got the brilliant idea, well, we're going to go to the United Nations and we're going to become the leader of the new international disability movement. And Mexico then sponsored a resolution in the United Nations to begin a drafting process to create a new international human rights convention to protect the rights of people with disabilities. So as you may know, in international law, human rights are protected by treaties. These are like a contract among nations as to what the rights are and how they will be protected. There are general treaties like the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the Economic and Social Rights Treaty, and then there are specialized treaties. There's a women's rights treaty, a children's rights treaty, a labor rights treaty, an immigration and asylum treaty, various specialized treaties, but there was no treaty on the rights of people with disabilities. I had built a career on showing how the human rights were actually protected by these very general treaties that never mentioned people with disabilities. But what a great thing to now have a treaty to protect people with disabilities. The drafting process for that treaty, in which Mexico was the hero because they had brought this to the, brought together disability groups throughout the world to come meet in the basement of the United Nations in New York. And the reason that they had to meet in the basement of the United Nations was that the UN building, the United Nations, does not fall under American law. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act, requiring public spaces to be physically accessible, does not apply to the United Nations. And there was only one meeting room in the United Nations that was actually accessible. So we had to meet in the basement. But disability groups from around the world came together every summer for 3 weeks, and the treaty was drafted. It was drafted in record time. It was the first treaty ever in which disability groups were allowed to, the stakeholders in the rights participated in the drafting from the very first process. And it really, the actual drafting of the treaty itself galvanized a world movement in international disability rights. It was fascinating even to see the government delegations. In the beginning of the drafting process, most governments had no people with disabilities on their delegations doing the negotiation. They started to learn by being locked up in a room for 3 weeks every summer with the disability groups what people with disabilities could do, and how the idea of the kind of refrain of the disability community, nothing about us without us, that this advocacy should never happen without the views of people with disabilities. The official delegations actually began to include people with disabilities, and the treaty itself was a fabulous accomplishment. It really pushed the limits of kind of a progressive vision of what disability rights could be under international law. In the area of work that I do, working on the rights of people in institutions, it concluded many rights which really push the outer limits and in many ways go beyond what we had in the United States. Article 19 recognizes the right of all people to live as part of the society with choices equal to others. We had been fighting for deinstitutionalization in the United States, and we essentially made the argument as institutions are abusive, you have to get rid of institutions because they're abusive, or there was a Supreme Court case in Olmstead versus LC which said institutions were discriminatory. It's a form of discrimination to serve people in an isolated environment when they're capable of living in society. But turning it from a negative into a positive, that people actually have a right to be part of society, this is recognized in the new treaty, which goes beyond what we had done in U.S. law. The United States is very much still a model in terms of having transformed our service systems, but some of the rights are actually better than what we've got in the United States. My work has transformed. I've now been doing this work for 25 years. The first half of the work, I was just trying to get disability rights on the table. In addition to publishing those reports, what we realized is that sustainable change would not happen in country unless you trained and created advocacy groups in their own countries. So after our first few reports, in which we were able to get tremendous publicity, we found if we wanted to make change, we had to go back and help advocacy groups get formed. We've actually created and spun off 7 different human rights groups in 7 different countries, either independent advocacy groups or projects of existing groups, all run by people with disabilities, in which there are alliances between lawyers and stakeholders working for human rights. My organization now have offices in Mexico, Serbia, Ukraine, the Republic of Georgia, all working to bring about sustainable change. So we're working on the local level to bring a bottom-up demand for change, and my organization works on the international level to use every lever we can for international pressure. Change is so difficult, deinstitutionalization is so hard, that you really require both a bottom-up and a top-down approach, and we do both. The final stage, I would say, in the new work that we do now that we have a convention, unlike the beginning where we just had to seek recognition of rights, now we're trying to push for implementation. Because just because the convention says there's a right to community integration, the reality is quite the contrary. Children alone, there are 10 million children in institutions around the world. And if you have a disability and you grow up in an institution, odds are you're going to go to an adult facility and remain there for the rest of your life. And so there are many more millions of adults with disabilities in psychiatric facilities, nursing homes. No international body has even begun to quantify that. And unfortunately, what we find is that well-meaning international donors and charities actually support. There are a lot of American money and Western European money that goes to support orphanages in other countries, which are breeding grounds for disability, which are incredibly abusive, and yet they are the product of misplaced, well-intentioned donations. Another critical element of the Disability Treaty is in Article 32, which says that international cooperation must be used to advance the goals and principles of the Convention. So it's not just good social policy again, or good foreign assistance policy to promote community integration. It's actually a requirement of international human rights law. If you're going to donate money abroad, you have to do so in a manner that recognizes and protects rights. If you're going to donate money and contribute to the segregation of people with disabilities, you're violating human rights law, both as a donor and in terms of the recipient countries. So one of the great new challenges that we have begun as an organization is to work to hold the donors accountable. And I could tell you many more stories about that, because in the end, holding governments accountable is one thing. We're now working on that next level, and that may be the most powerful lever for change that we have. So that's the 25-year history of the work that I'm doing. Why don't we stop? We can ask some questions, and then I'd like to show you some video of what we've seen and what we're doing in some of these countries, but I can kind of tailor what we show to what would be useful for you. Any thoughts, questions based upon this?
Pass the audience first. I
Yep.
believe there's a question.
Thank you very much for coming.
Sure.
I'm very interested personally in disabled people. I was talking with my friend here. I have a cousin with Down syndrome, and I think that yes, the law, international law, is a part, but also how society integrates these people.
Where are you
He's
from?
From Chile.
Okay.
He's 31 years old, and he only doesn't speak well. For me, it's like a normal person. It's like he knows how to socialize. He can pick up the the subway or the bus and go to his activities and go back home by himself. And I have been in several birthdays of him, and I can see another children with Down syndrome that because their families choose to hide them, they are not able even to talk with anyone. So my question is, the law is a part, I'm not very familiar with the law part of it, but what do you think, or how do you see now in terms of society integrating these people with disabilities?
Right.
For example, in Chile, I think that my country in this sense is a little bit incoherent, because every year we do a telethon. I don't know if you
Yes, I do know about that, yes.
once a year or one every 2 years, and everybody goes and advocates for disabled people. Everybody donates money, but only 1% of our disabled people, that is around 3 million people out of 18 million people, that is Chilean citizens, have been integrated in the workforce and in society. The rest are completely abandoned.
Right.
We have a ministry in Chile, it's of the government, that it's about disabled people. They look forward to make policies that protect them, but still, my society is very, very far away of an ideal society that integrates them.
Well, the question of culture is a very important one, particularly since mental illness itself, is at some level a cultural construct. In the area that I work in, how people perceive mental illness is very much perceived. When I started this work, I expected to see enormous cultural variations. What has amazed me, as I've now done work in 36 countries on 5 continents, is the enormous similarities in the problems, the segregation, the stigma. And in every single country that I've gone, when I tell the story about the liberation movement in the United States and the work towards community integration, people stop me and say, "That's great. It's wonderful that it worked in the United States. But you have to understand, my country is different. And in my country, we have these very special cultural concerns. Either we have fear about mental illness, or we have misunderstanding about intellectual disabilities, or families would never adopt children from institutions because we have strong biological bloodlines and we would never accept foster children." There's a series of explanations that we get, each one attributing it to the culture of their society, and yet each one is shockingly similar. I can tell you that in the United States, there's a series of very interesting case law. When the United States decided to close its institutions and create group homes, there was such community resistance that neighbors would burn effigies on the lawns of group homes for children with intellectual disabilities when they tried to move them in. There was fear. There was every form of opposition. And yet, in the case of Claiborne, the United States Supreme Court said these are civil rights issues in the same way that civil rights are about fighting prejudice. People have a right to be part of society. And what we find is that when people are actually integrated, there will be prejudice, there will be opposition. But when it is accepted and enforced as a civil right or as a human right, that's what the court systems are meant for, that's what the legal systems are meant for. And amazingly enough, once people with disabilities become part of society, the stereotypes break down. As you have a brother who is just a normal person, as people get to know your brother, they start to realize, oh, having a kid with Down syndrome or an adult with Down syndrome is not such a bad thing. When kids are introduced into schools, when kids grow up with other people with disabilities, so the more integration you have, the more the barriers break down. So as a human rights lawyer, we push against the cultural. I have every respect for the importance of cultural differences, and yet I also understand that prejudices that are irrational against people with disabilities must be fought, and it's part of what the rights struggle is about everywhere.
Other questions?
Yeah.
I have a few questions, but the first one I want to ask is very specific to disaster response situation, and I've been doing that in different places over the last 10 years, and as a medical doctor. But do you know, are you aware of any specific framework that provides focused access or focused services to people with disability in a disaster response situation?
Well, there is a provision in the convention on situations of humanitarian emergencies, essentially saying that special attention needs to be made toward people with disabilities. Broadly speaking, the disability law framework is an anti-discrimination framework, so that in any context, you always have to take into consideration the concerns of people with disabilities. So in whatever disaster response you are doing, you have to think about how people with disabilities are going to be concerned. We know that people with disabilities are at greater risk anytime you have. I mean, in Hurricane Katrina in the United States, when they evacuated people, who were the people who got left behind? The people who were, in hospitals and who couldn't get out, and some of them ended up getting killed. In the work that I've done, we did work in Kosovo. After the NATO occupation and the UN took over Kosovo, what we found is that psychiatric hospitals where people had been detained, the staff had literally run away during the war and left people behind. The irony is that the people went out and foraged for food and took care of themselves within the psychiatric facility, and they survived holding together without any staff. And then ironically, when the international community came, they then rebuilt the institution and locked them up, even after they had proved that they could survive without assistance. One of the other shocking things that we found, and we found this again time and again, is that women are subject to violence, and in times of turmoil, the amount of gender-based violence increases. And after the situation in Bosnia, in which rape was used as a weapon of war, there were internationally funded relief programs meant to target and help women who had been raped. And yet, when we visited Kosovo, we found that the same programs that had been set up to help women subject to rape and trauma themselves discriminated against women with disabilities, that it was assumed that if you were a normal person who had been raped or abused, you could receive some support and some psychotherapy and return to the community. But we found an American U.S. government-funded major program to treat women survivors of sexual abuse that said, well, we are not equipped to deal with women who have mental illness, so those women will refer to the psychiatric hospitals. And in the psychiatric hospitals, we found systemic rape and trafficking of women with disabilities. So ironically, the international crisis response around women's issues ended up perpetuating the very same problems. That's an area where the humanitarian relief programs had to be sensitized, not only to how to include women with disabilities into their programs, but that in a context in which the local service system discriminates. If you're in New York City and you want to run a trauma program that doesn't deal with women who have serious psychiatric disabilities, perhaps you can refer them to the mainstream mental health system. But if you are existing in a country where the mainstream mental health system is the major source of abuse, you can't do that, and you have to think those issues through. So in every context, you have to do more than not discriminate. You have to be aware of where the pressure points on the system are and where the abuses are so that you don't make them worse.
Can I just, one point to that is you might want to have a look at some of the standard setting mechanisms for humanitarian relief providers, NGOs and donors, Sphere and HAP. Do you know those humanitarian?
In fact, that was what I was coming to, is are there specific agencies or institutions which are working with the response groups? For example, I'm talking about the recent Nepal earthquake, where there were relief camps set up, right, where none of the toilets were accessible. Not a single one that we could see. So that's very, very specific, and there were all kinds of big NGOs, there were international governments which were setting up these camps.
Right.
Indian government, Chinese government, ICRC,
Mm-hmm.
MSF, all of these. And if they're all aware of these things,
Mm-hmm. Well, they're not. I can tell you that all the international agencies tend to be, each one tends to lack awareness. It has to be built into each one.
Is there a mechanism, or is there an agency?
In theory, the UN Disability Convention is the standard and is the mechanism. And so non-discrimination is the general principle. There are specialized programs being, I know the International Women's Refugee Commission, for example, has created a manual on internally displaced people and how to incorporate internally displaced people with disabilities into programs. So there are programs like that. I think it's less about the international legal standards than it's simply about good models of practice and how you integrate. I've been called in recently by the U.S. Congress that is providing humanitarian relief services to refugees from Syria. And they're asking me, what do we do with the mental health component of people who are subject to trauma? If your home has been bombed out and relatives of yours have been killed, there must be an enormous amount of mental health problems and trauma caused in that, and how do you provide relief in a manner that's sensitive to those? And many people are just figuring that out as we go along. And ironically, it was actually in terms of, post-Katrina, that the Office of Homeland Security developed special protocols for how to deal with disability in situations of disaster. And so there are models that are being created now. So it's a great and a very important area. I run a small organization. We have not specialized specifically in those kinds of issues, but they're out there, and where we've encountered them, we've found serious problems.
Well, I do, let me add that, I do see in the US INGO community that Mobility International, for instance, for a decade now has been both raising awareness as well as pushing the rest of the US INGO community through the code of conduct, for instance, to insert to mainstream disability issues in terms of what are the practices of these other NGOs. How successful it is, I can't judge. But there is internal advocacy within the NGO community to change.
Yes, I've seen that process. I'm not a big fan of it.
No?
I mean, it tends to be a checklist. That there needs to be some kind of deeper understanding that I know that Mobility International has worked with Interaction to create disability standards. When groups don't really understand what they're doing, the standards like that are just not that useful. Of course, you can't argue with them. They're a starting point, but a lot more needs to be done beyond that.
Yeah.
Just about the same. Since the last year, there was highly nice words about the Sendai conference in Japan, where they hugely discussed about disaster response, and that many things were discussed about, like person with disability. Maybe they may have some good outcomes, some models. I don't know.
The sad, I mean, for me at least personally, because I'm so hands-on, I'm on the field,
Right.
and I'm aware of these things that are going on at a policy level and at a framework, level. There are things, but none of that is being implemented.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, Nepal. My colleague Laurie Ahern just wrote a piece in the Huffington Post about the situation in Nepal before the earthquake. It is the ground zero for where international donors caused massive problems. In terms of orphanages, if you scroll back 10 years ago in Nepal, there were 3 orphanages. And then there's a whole new movement of what's called voluntourism, of people who want to travel to pretty places and volunteer and help people out. And there's a big business that getting created in Nepal. In order to volunteer in orphanages, you need kids. And there are a lot of poor families who will put their kids in an orphanage if they're paid. And there are now more than 500 orphanages in Nepal as a result of, and CNN Heroes likes to give awards to people who set up orphanages, when this is exact opposite of what they've been doing. So all of this happened even before the earthquake, so I could imagine what happens after the earthquake when you've got this problem that's already been created.
I just want to jump on, and then Danielle, I was really intrigued when you said, about the orphanages, and that so many donors, both individual small donors as well as institutional donors and NGOs support orphanages,
Yeah.
and how bad that is
Yes.
from your perspective.
Yeah.
So does that mean that I don't know this? SOS Villages, that's a wrong approach from
SOS Villages is already starting to change their approach because they are
This is a
essentially
group home.
a purveyor of orphanages. They are generally clean and nice, but the bottom line is, in terms of psychology and mental health, we know that children need to form emotional attachments to individuals. If not a family member, then a substitute family. So the SOS orphanage model is very clean and nice, but they have staff who come and go. They call them mothers, but they're not mothers, and the children know the difference. And so if the mother will be in there for 6 months and then leave, the emotional attachments are broken, and it's essentially the perpetuation of the orphanage
So
model.
even if they are seeming to move to
They-
a group home
They're
situation,
very
it's-
beautiful and nice, and they're just a cleaner form of orphanage. So I personally am very critical of.
Sorry. Just to add to that, I mean, there is documented evidence, there are lessons learned already. I've done work in Southeast Asia. Cambodia is a big example.
Yeah.
Where we've already gone through that whole cycle, and
Yeah.
now so many orphanages are being shut down. Reintegration is the primary
Yeah.
thing that they're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And then we have that whole movement kind of shifting base to some other country.
Mhm.
You know,
Daniela.
All right, I have kind of a two-part question. One is about U.S. based, and the other is more international based. On the U.S. perspective, I have experience with social work and working with people who have different mental health disabilities. I have a brother who has a physical disability, and I guess my perspective is that the U.S. still has a lot of work to do
Yes.
on disability
Yeah.
rights. So I'm kind of curious on your perspective on what the U.S. should be taking as their next steps.
Right.
And the second part is I'm also taking international human rights law, so I
Great.
really think it's very fascinating. And
Who are you studying with?
Cora Trufrost.
Okay, I don't know her, but
But so I'm curious about, I guess, one of like the biggest examples of when the International Covenant on Disabilities was enacted and when it was successful.
you want examples of it being successful.
When it was enacted, so like when
Yeah. It was
used in
it was
specific
adopted
case.
in 2006 and entered into force in 2009. And it's had a tremendous influence in many different areas. The first step has been that many countries have rewritten their laws to try to conform to it. Rewriting your law is always the easy part. As a lawyer, I'm highly skeptical of of course you have to rewrite your law, but too many people rewrite their law and assume the problem is solved. So there are many, many areas in which implementation is lagging. I'm sure there are success stories, and I would say one of the greatest successes is actually the fact that the process is going on and the development of advocacy movements of people who are working to enforce it is the first really great success of the Disability Convention. In terms of the United States, of course, absolutely, we have a long way to go. We are way ahead of many countries in some regards and way behind in other regards. There are a lot of ways in which the Europeans have much more developed community social service systems. We tend to have a more rights-oriented approach than a lot of the European countries that have actually a fairly paternalistic approach. And so there are countries in Western Europe, for example, that pour a lot more money into community services than we do, and yet have more segregated paternalistic approaches than we do. So in particular, you have to really look specifically at what issue in what country. I don't do work in the United States, and in fact, I don't do work in any country that does a good job because I specialize as a small organization in rooting out the worst places. So in terms of models of where to go or where the best places are, it's not really something that I have at my fingertips. I do know one of the things that we're thinking of doing is when we've been fighting for institutionalization of children around the world, many donors say to me, how can you call on the closure of all institutions for children in other countries when we put children in institutions in the United States. So my organization is now looking to do a project on fighting institutionalization of children in the United States. So children with medical issues and more severe disabilities are still placed in institutions in many, many places. To me, that's an absolute top priority, and the fact that it exists is shameful. I know that in terms of long-term adult psychiatric facilities, we still have thousands of individuals segregated from society for no good reason other than the lack of community supports. So in the areas that I specialize in, I'm embarrassed to say we have serious big problems.
Other questions? I know I have, but I want to give you a
Oh,
chance.
you go ahead.
Oh, you go.
Well, I have many questions, but I don't want to take time. You're talking mostly about closing institutions.
Yep, yep.
You know, when I was working, started my disability work, I was working for a project called Community-Based Rehabilitation, so CBR, which was mostly preparing the communities, families to keep the children with disabilities at home, not sending to institutions.
Right.
But
Now, is this for people with physical disabilities?
all kinds of disabilities.
All kinds of
So
disabilities.
we're mostly focusing on local communities.
Okay.
To, prepare awareness raising,
Okay.
mainstreaming, all this thing. And one of my colleagues said at work, I was working at World Vision, and he said I would smash it one day, all the institutions. I mean, it was a very emotional word, of course. But then we started discussing, okay, what if, like, today, all, like as he said, all institutions are closed? Is it the right decision? I mean, without preparing communities, what would be the future, next day
Right.
of those children? And families
Right.
are not ready to accept,
Right.
communities not ready to accept.
Right. Well, there's the easy answer and the hard answer. The easy answer, which is politically what I normally give, and if you actually look at our published reports, you will see, which is don't close institutions overnight. You have to plan for the creation of community services. You have to have a careful outflow. And I mean, in the United States, we saw that institutions were closed too quickly without community services being available. It created homelessness in our streets, and it created a backlash against deinstitutionalization because the perceptions were that deinstitutionalization had failed, and there was then a push to put people back in institutions. So as a baseline, of course, you have to be careful about you doing it. All of that said, what I have found is that that argument is overused to justify complacency in many, many parts of the world. And indeed, our work has been called dangerous by officials at UNICEF because we're pushing for deinstitutionalization, and their view is, how can you close orphanages when there are not community services? And how can you create community services without an inclusive process in which people with disabilities and family members are involved? And you have to have a national planning process, and you have to have inclusive education, and you have to have support services, and you have to have trained professionals, and you have to have interdisciplinary teams ready to receive. You can use that process to delay change. And what I have seen is that in orphanages, I've seen children whose teeth are pulled out with pliers because they're perceived as not being able to experience pain. I've seen people sexually abused. I've seen kids locked in isolation cells for the administrative convenience of the staff. There are such immediate life-saving dangers that after 20 years, my patience is running out, and it is at some level very dangerous to assume that we're going to hold people safely in institutions until the community services are created. It's important to realize that the institutions are not safe places, and so the time that it's taking you to create those community services is subjecting people to safety. And what I've also found is that there are shortcuts that you can take, that the core thing that people need is housing and some form of social support. And given the lack of meaningful services that people get in institutions, if you're going to get no services in institution versus no services in the community, I grow more and more in favor of giving people housing, food, and some form of social support, and then building it later and getting that change. What we saw in terms of advocacy in the United States for change is that we had court-ordered no new admissions policies in many countries, in many locations in the United States. And it's a research topic that I would love to get a student to do, to study the effectiveness of no new admissions policies. Because I believe that only when authorities say we're not going to add any more, the ones who are in institutions, okay, don't move them out until you can create but you should adopt a policy that says we're not going to add any more, and as children come forward in need of services, create the services they need so that they never have to leave the family or the community before you put them in the institution. And so I'm, in a sense, becoming more radical as I grow older on this subject.
Can I
Yeah, sure.
add to that? This is again out of personal experience. One of the partners that we've been closely working with for several years now has a very, very effective model, which is a daycare institution, which works very closely with families. They come in the morning and go back in the evening. The institution has all the infrastructure, has all the specialties, additional services, and they also have a residential program for short term, for 10 days, to train people with families. And what we recently launched in November in partnership with SU is a Fit Families program, where we are training the caregivers, the families, in sports, in sports. For children with visual impairment and autism, which will then extend to other.
Where is this taking place?
In Bangalore, in South India.
Oh, interesting.
So that's just an example that I wanted to give, to say you don't have to shut down institutions, but there are options. But then there are also situations where you have to have institutions right now. It's not like either or kind of situation. We run an institution ourselves in Bangalore again, which has about 100 children who are HIV positive. But the sad part is, if we don't have them in the institution, they are going to die because they don't have access to treatment, which is essential for them.
And that treatment can't be provided in the context of a family?
Because it's so stigmatized, nobody wants to keep them.
So that is
yeah.
a situational limitation.
Exactly.
It's not
So-
an inherent, there's nothing inherent about HIV treatment that requires institutional placement. So I understand that you may have to do that because there isn't better, but that doesn't mean that the goal shouldn't be.
That's,
Right.
fair enough, I understand. Just giving both the
Right.
examples, and both
Yeah.
are in the same place, in the same city. And
Got it.
very-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me follow up with one question I had, that since you mentioned housing and other things. So part of the fulfillment of the human rights of people with disabilities is around economic, social, and maybe cultural, but certainly economic and social rights, not just political and civil rights, right? If I look at the kind of convergence that I see in the broader INGO community between human rights and development NGOs around rights-based approaches and around ESC rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, one of the pushbacks that these NGOs and a few bilateral donors and UN agencies, as you know, who have also adopted those approaches, is that this whole term of progressive fulfillment, like how would you measure that a government as a duty bearer, or that donors, as you say, as duty bearers, right, that they will actually, that they make enough progress on the road to full fulfillment of the rights of people with disabilities. Does that play a role at all?
Well,
in the
absolutely.
discussion?
I mean, it's essentially the legal framework for the previous discussion we had. I mean, we accept that deinstitutionalization requires planning and creation of community-based services, and then the question is, how quick can you do that? You know, 2/3 of the countries of the world have a beautiful plan for how they're going to deinstitutionalize, and the beautiful plan that takes 10, 15, 20 years. The CRPD committee actually ruled in one case that a beautiful plan that takes 30 years is not a beautiful plan. And so my organization is in fact arguing for the adoption of no new admissions policies. And you could put it in the legal, I mean, the distinction between economic, social rights, and civil and political rights is ultimately arbitrary And this is probably one of the better examples of it,
Exactly.
because the lack of social services causes discrimination, segregation, and exposure to torture. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has said that placement in the institution, that the emotional pain caused by separation from society and loved ones can amount to nothing less than torture. And therefore, you could argue of the immediate obligation to create the services necessary to prevent that. And so that is the direction that we're going. And that's why my organization tends to fight this as a torture issue, as a discrimination issue, to argue for immediate implementation.
Right. And then what you get then, of course, is governments who say, a government of Cambodia, I used to work there a long time ago, and it's a pretty bad place in many ways, including on these issues, will say, I'm sorry, there's no way we can ever public budget-wise afford this in the near term.
Right. And then the other argument is that if you have X amount of money to spend, the exact same money could be used to provide community services rather than institutional care.
Right.
And so it's in terms of the available resources are there. The problem with the institutionalization is that even if community services in the end will cost less than institutions, that the process of transformation can cost more. And that's where the argument for international support. We are working with Congress right now to try to get a bill passed on deinstitutionalization, with the argument that one of the key roles that international donors can play is to help countries get over that hump. Because in terms of their economic development, you could make the argument that once they're over that hump, that the lack of community services is actually causing unnecessarily costs to society.
Right.
And that because the money is caught up in the institutional system, it makes reform impossible.
Got it.
I'm sorry, I keep pointing this direction. I'm sorry to give you my back, but
we have another 5 minutes, unless we want to show a video. So do you want? I think
well,
you have. You maybe have the gentleman first, and then you, and then we'll finish it up.
Yeah, I remember you saying earlier in your little talk was that there wasn't really a whole lot of unity amongst the disabled people's organizations. Kind of in the international community. I've been a member of ASAN, like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, for quite some time now, and one of the things that we're interested in a lot is intersectionality, as in trying to make sure that not just disabled people's organizations, but any groups that are trying to that have had experience facing some form of discrimination, that we're all kind of more or less on the same page. But that kind of just made me wonder how. Since you first got involved, since you first formed DRI, how more unified has these disabled people's organizations, both within the U.S. and in the international community, has that unity gotten stronger? Kind of stay the same?
I'm not sure what I may have said early on. So in terms of unity, there was actually, during the drafting process, a coalition that was formed that was called the International Disability Alliance, which was a very, very powerful alliance of existing disability groups. That alliance has broken down since the adoption of the CRPD. I'm personally, I've never been a big proponent of unity. Broad coalitions are good because there's strength in numbers, and when large groups of people can all work together, they have more power than when they're working separately. So around specific issues like the drafting of the convention, having all the disability groups work together is great. But, two people with psychiatric disabilities can disagree on the outcome of a solution. So the idea that they would all speak always with one voice, even on the issue of forced treatment. Chris Wallace, who was on CBS News, received ECT, and he says it saved his life and it was the greatest thing in the world. And so he's a person who had a mental health diagnosis and got ECT, and he says it's great. And most organized groups of people with psychiatric disabilities say it's awful. And so it's natural for there to be more than one viewpoint on many issues, much as coalitions have their role.
Yeah, unity probably wasn't the right word. Coalition's probably
Yeah.
the better way to
Yeah.
describe what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk to you from autism. My oldest teenager is on the autism spectrum, and I just discovered that self-advocacy network.
Yeah. No, I have a great respect. I know Ari Naaman very well and the organization that he does, and there's another fabulous group based in Geneva. Eric Kaufmel, I guess is his name.
I've heard about it. I'm actually I'm in the process of applying to the SU abroad Geneva program.
Okay.
So I mean it's.
I've been on listservs with them, and they've just got fabulous, amazing material. So there's an amazing international group that's working on autism that I have the greatest respect for.
Yeah. So there was one more question.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that was what I was going to ask was organizations, not advocacy organizations, but service providing organizations, how closely are they involved in this process?
Service, yeah.
And the second part to that is, has there been any resistance or even opposition from within the community to the kind of work that you're doing?
Yes, there has been. The disability treaty, there was a very strong, powerful role of people with disabilities. I think a lot of governments had no idea what they were getting themselves into, and a lot of service providers didn't quite pay attention. And there are provisions in the CRPD that, particularly from the point of view of mental health professions, regarding forced treatment, legal capacity, where they didn't really participate in drafting, and then they were shocked at what the outcome was. And there's been a big pushback now. There was just a big article in Lancet by some of the top psychiatrists of the world saying that the CRPD undermines the health of people with mental disabilities by recognizing taking such a strong statement against coercive treatment. So that battle is still happening. The whole movement is so new that there's still a lot of the subtlety and nuance is yet to engage.
But you would even, I think the newness certainly makes it more so, but you would have similar vigorous discussions within other NGO communities around treaties and wording and...
I mean, I actually think that we are lucky that the mental health community was as poorly organized as we were. From my point of view, we would not have gotten such a powerful document. That said, I think the discussion is now important. We never would have had this discussion if they hadn't created the space to get that viewpoint, and now we're starting to engage to figure it out.
But I was thinking the same thing. I would love to be a fly on the wall when I don't know much, and Mirjam has been educating me about, but like Handicap International or Mobility International and others who are more on the, as I understand, more on the service side, right? How they would debate with you around some of these things, where you have convergence a lot, I imagine, and where you are different.
Well, both Mobility International, as you can imagine, has a much more of a physical disability focus, so they don't really weigh in too much on these particular issues. But
you've been telling me about Handicap International, some of the cleavages within the disability sector. That are
a lot of disability groups don't consider Handicapped International a disability group because it lacks disability leadership, and they view it as more of a charity or a service provider rather than a disability group itself.
And that is a classical...
I don't personally know enough to say that might be totally inaccurate, so far be it from me to critique Handicapped International. That's just what I've heard.
Right, interesting.
It'll be interesting to also see. We co-host a summit in Bangalore every year. This will be the 6th year this year, which is an inclusion summit, which brings together all the institutions working in the disability space in India, and we also have speakers from outside who come in and address. So it'll be interesting to see if we can have a panel or a discussion around this. I'll send you more details if you're...
Yeah, absolutely. My organization, we've never done work in Asia, and we are looking for opportunities to do so, so I'm very open to it. Nepal is one of the countries that we'd really like to get to look at the situation of the orphanages there. Vice just did a very interesting program on mental health in India. I don't know if you've seen it.
What is Vice?
Vice is a news purveyor of news that's a kind of exploding, very large news agency that does some very powerful video that's now covered on HBO, but they did a documentary on mental health in India that I just watched, extremely powerful, and I'd be interested in your views on it.